Hello everybody and welcome to A Question of Property. My name is Lucia France and I'm here to host your panel of property experts here on Zoom. So as usual, answering your questions today are our star panel. We've got John Howard, our property expert developer, Ipswich advocate and author of more than 3 books on the subject. He's currently writing his 4th. He's had 40 years experience in the industry. So good morning to you, John.
That's some build-up. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We also have Stefano Lucatello, our legal brain of the panel and senior partner at Cobalt Law International Property Lawyers, and of course, expert on buying and selling property abroad. Good morning, Stefano.
Morning, Lucia. Morning, everyone.
Morning, morning. And of course, Paul Mahoney as well, our resident Aussie, best-selling author, award-winning property speaker, and head of Nova Financial Group. Welcome to you, Paul, and how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Okay, guys, nice to see you all. Now, we have a question to kick off with this morning, which has come from one of the comments on the videos that have been posted up on YouTube. So let's just get that up there now. A lovely comment from a viewer, awesome vid, but in your next video, please can you describe your greatest life moment? So I'm going to put that to you first, Paul, because I think that came from your channel.
Yeah, I was thinking about this one and I don't know, I think you can upset some people with the wrong answer this one, can't you?
Oh dear.
I don't know, I suppose I have to say the birth of my daughter, closely followed by getting married to my wife. Closely followed by meeting John Howard, I suppose.
Oh.
Absolutely. Well,
if
let's give our top 3.
If only that was true.
That's actually a good idea, Paul. If we stick with our top 3, then we've got less of a chance of offending anybody in the family. So, Stefano, your best moment.
My best moment, I think the best moment was passing my Law Society examinations, which I did on the 3rd occasion. All the best lawyers don't get it first time, just like all the best drivers don't get it first time.
I'm not sure about that.
But in the times when I was sitting my exams in the late 70s, early 80s, if you failed it more than 3 times, you were banned from coming into the profession totally, because you had 3 strikes and that was it. And then I was a member of a group of students who objected to this and wrote to the Law Society and threatened to take it to the EEC as it was, the European Court of Justice as it was there, and they changed the law. So I helped to change the law before I even became a lawyer.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So that was
wow.
that was one of my moments.
You were very nearly banned.
Yeah, I was banned from becoming a solicitor because in those days, if you took it 3 times, they thought that you weren't good enough to. I was only failing it by 2 or 3 points. It was a question of learning how to actually put a reply down on paper,
Yeah.
and that was the reason why. But then you had 3 strikes and that was it. But they changed the law, they changed the rules, and they said it was anti-competitive, and it was all to do with competition and one thing and another. And so it was changed basically.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's funny though, you can't do that with driving tests. I think you can take driving tests as many times as you want. I know someone that's taken it 14 times.
Well, there's some woman that's got the record. She's about 90 times. She's about 83.
Really?
Mm.
Some people pass first time, don't they, Paul?
I passed first time.
I passed first time. I'll have you know.
I do think though the written exams are a bit backwards, especially in this day and age when you can pull everything up on your phone. Having to remember an equation or a line in a law book is a bit ridiculous, really, isn't it? It's more about practice than it is memory.
Well, I mean, they changed the rules because now most exams, even for law exams, you can actually take the books into the examination.
Can you?
And
that's cheating. That might explain quite a lot, Stefano.
Well, in my time, it didn't. It was all up here. If you had
quite right. You can't beat experience.
Absolutely.
Exactly, and you can't carry a book around with you as well.
No.
So John, let's go on to your greatest life moment.
Well, I'm going to sound super selfish when I say that, but I'm not going to mention family because that's obvious, really. I know disrespect to Paul because he's much younger and it's all newer to him, and I understand that. But thank you for being. I don't mind being 3rd. That's fair enough behind his lovely wife and a daughter. Now, for me, I think first of all, my 3 things I would say were buying my first property on my 18th birthday, The second thing, I think, was becoming a director of Cambridge United at 25, which was the youngest director of Football League club in the country. What would be my third? That's interesting. My third, I think, writing my 3 books, to be fair, because my English teacher at school would have had his head in his hands and you know, said it's not possible. And I've done it. So they're the 3 things I'd say I'm proud of.
Fantastic.
What about yours, Lucia?
My top 3. Oh,
yeah.
Right. Quick, off the top of my head, I guess.
Working with us.
Working with you guys, of course.
Thank you.
That goes without saying. That goes without saying.
Of course, that's like family. Yeah.
Actually, I write short stories, and I've had 2 of those performed on one of the biggest, well, the biggest horror podcast in the world. So they're available.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so it was amazing to hear the stories come to life, and you know, the voice actors bring them to life. Marrying my husband.
Of course, yeah.
In the other room, I think he can hear me.
Of course he is.
And my 2 little nieces, when they were born, I love them so much, and they've brought a lot of happiness to my life. So yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Right. Let's move on then with our first question for Paul. Paul, this is a tough decision here for our viewer. I'm torn between becoming a long-term buy-to-let investor and doing more developing property for profit. What do you advise?
Okay. So, you know, a fairly common question. I think that the simple answer to this, it will very much depend on the amount of time, resources, and probably experience this person has behind them. You know, if for example, they're like a lot of our clients and they're time poor, then property development probably isn't for them.
Right.
Because effectively, it's a second job. You know, it's a business. It's a much more entrepreneurial approach to property, to investing in property. And it's going to take time. It's going to take resources. And of course, there is generally a bit more inherent risk with that approach than there is with a more conservative buy-to-let approach. So I think that's probably the main determining factor. Yeah. Also whether they, you know, have a passion for it. You know, I think in business, to make things work, you need to have a passion for it. You need to be willing to go the extra mile. And I think that probably, again, applies more so to property development than it does to passive property investment.
Right.
I'm sure John will weigh in here at some point. But yeah, I think that would be the main thing. As I say, a lot of our clients are, you know, what you would call cash rich, time poor. And for that type of person, unless they have someone that they can absolutely rely upon and are willing to give their cash to them and have them go off and do property development, it's probably not for them. And therefore, more of a passive approach that doesn't take up much of their time, but still getting exposure to property and getting some pretty, you know, double-digit returns in safe locations and safe properties can make a lot of sense so far as building a portfolio. Whereas if, for example, they've, you know, made a lot of money in business, sold a business, inherited some money, they've got time on their hands, and maybe they've done some property investment in the past, so they have some experience with it, and therefore can work out what works and how to make money from it, or engage with someone like John to help them do it, then maybe that's better for them as well. It really depends on the person's situation, as with any investment option.
I guess they could, you know, if they were working with a partner as well who had more time, perhaps that could be an option, John, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think Paul's absolutely right. I think if you haven't got a lot of time, and also if you're risk averse, you know, some people worry about, taking a more of a risky approach to property. And I don't, you know, and I think we've said this before about all these educators, you know, they make out that anyone can do it all and it suits everyone. It doesn't suit everyone, and it's horses for courses. And absolutely right. You know, when I look back now at times and I see, you know, how successful people have been by just, you know, buying and retaining property rather than developing it and selling it and moving on, you know, I do wonder sometimes why I bothered at times. But I think it really just does depend on the person, because like I said, if you're risk averse and you worry about, to a point you worry about things, then one, you perhaps shouldn't be doing property at all, by the way, but if you are going to do it, you know, long-term investment is the way forward. And if you're a little bit racy and you want to, you know, turn things up a bit and get a bit more thrill out of it, if you like, then the developing side is far more profitable, can be in the long run. But you have to remember there's more risks involved.
Yeah.
Doesn't age affect it? So someone my age, 58, as opposed to someone who's in the 30s, you know, depends how quickly, we were talking about this last week, I think.
100.
Quickly want to realise you're
well, first of all, Stefano, as a lawyer, you should tell the truth, and I can't believe you're only 58. But there we go.
It's all the creams. It's all the creams, John.
Yeah, well, I didn't say which way, did I? The other thing, I don't think it matters. I think the only thing I would say is, as you get older, on the whole, you get more cautious because you don't want to lose what you've got. And I think that comes into a little bit. But of course, you know, I've got a lot of people, or a few people I help who are older and, you know, and are more relaxed about it because they've got the money behind them. So it just depends. It really does. But you've made a good point.
A slight caveat to that as well is I think some people do watch too much shows like Homes Under the Hammer and that sort of thing.
Definitely.
It makes it look very easy and cheap and profitable. And that's not the case, as you know, John. There's much more involved.
It's hard work.
And sometimes you can lose money, believe it or not, like any business. So some people aren't cut out for that and don't want that. And therefore, it's not necessarily the road to riches, developing property. It can be, of course, but it's not always.
No, I agree with that.
I have experience of working on one of, it's not quite the same, but it was called 60-Minute Makeover on ITV. And that was my first ever job in television. And I was a runner on it and then a researcher. And wow, like these people it looked amazing when we did the transformation and we did it within the hour and everything. But there were lots of things that were, the camera couldn't see, shall we say. And that was just a superficial makeover show. So I can imagine with property developing, I think there's probably a lot that you don't see in those programs as well.
A lot of stress can be.
Yeah, exactly. Right, thank you very much for the answers to that one, guys. Stefano, we are moving to Milan now. So this person says, I've got a flat in Milan that's been rented to an elderly lady who has passed away. Her son is now saying that he is living there. Am I able to evict him? I've not accepted any rent from him knowingly. So,
property rentals abroad, I think we've discussed this before, are fraught with problems in that when the lease or the tenancy is over 1 year, then depending which of the countries it is in, it can go to become a automatic either 3-year, 4-year or 5-year lease. That's the rule usually. So first of all, we'd have to look at the type of tenancy that the lady had. It may very well be that, dependent how old this chap was, he might have been living with his mother at the time of her death. And in any case, whatever he was doing or wasn't doing, the landlord will have a problem getting him out. You can't just go in there and throw him out. We have the same protection laws in Italy as we have in England. So protection from eviction, harassment, that sort of thing. So one being civil, one being criminal. And it's not as easy as just going in there and saying, get out. You'd have to go to court. It's not easy, it's costly, it takes a while to do. And in essence, it's not the easiest of things. I mean, I would just possibly ask the guy to reconsider whether this guy is a good tenant to keep on. And if he's a good guy, keep him on, and then you've still got a rental flow coming in. But if we don't have in Italy the same rules that we have in England in certain cases where the landlord is able to regain possession for his own personal use. We don't have that. So
no, that's interesting, because of course in the UK we have second generation tenancy on assured tenants where you know they can take over from their parents. And of course when Labour were in government, there was third generation as well, but that was stopped quite a few years ago. The only other thing I can think that you haven't mentioned really is you know, if he wants some money to go, it might be cheaper to pay him some money to leave than it is going to court, you know. But
you've got to be careful. You've got to be careful there, John, because it could be seen as bribery, and there are rules against that.
Yeah, I suppose the way to do it is to get a legal document drawn up by yourself or something like that, and then getting both parties to sign it, isn't it? And then give them the money to go, and at the same time he gives you the keys.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's not easy.
No.
In some cases, future generations can take over leases from previous people. It would also depend on, I mean, it would have a much stronger case if he was actually living there at the time when his mum was there, than if he's decided just to move in, I don't know, move from London to Milan and take it up as if it were a new tenancy. So you'd have to look at the rental agreement. I wouldn't do anything apart from instruct a lawyer. And thirdly, I think more than certainly, if the guy doesn't want to move out, you'd have to take proceedings in the Milanese courts and wait for them to go through and get them out. But it's a long-winded exercise.
Yeah.
So in that case, Stefano, it's worth just, like you always say, communication first and speak to the.
Absolutely.
See what
Absolutely.
Always talk to people if you can. Always.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, John, your first question for today is this.
Yes.
I've heard John say now on a number of occasions that he thinks the development and investment market will deteriorate over the next 18 months in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
However, I disagree.
Oh.
There is a huge shortage of housing, which I think will shore up the market. Can John give me his thoughts on this?
Well, of course, what a surprise someone doesn't agree with me. Goodness me, that's new, isn't it? Not. Okay, so I always ask myself questions to get the answers. Okay, so if I ask this gentleman the question, do you think there'll be more unemployment next year than there is this year? I'd imagine he would agree with me. If I said to him, does he think banks will lend loan to value less than they are now or have done next year? I'm sure the answer will be yes as well. And if I ask him, do you think we'll be in a recession next year, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer thinks, and he should know because he's at the sharp end of it all, then I'd imagine he'd say yes to that as well. So there's three negatives. He's got one positive, which there's a couple of positives to be fair. One is absolutely right. There is a housing shortage, mainly in the south of the country, of course, but I appreciate that. There is a housing shortage, and any property problem, I think, is only going to be for a couple of years or so, and then we'll get back online anyway, probably. But unemployment, I believe, is the biggest driver in property prices. So if employment is very high, then more people are confident, they want to buy property, and they can buy property. If there's a lot of unemployed people, not only do the people who are unemployed not be able to buy and probably might need to sell and rent, but also there's no confidence in the market. So even if you've got a job, you might be concerned about your job, or you might be just a bit embarrassed that you've got a good job and no one else has. You're not in the mood normally to move and so on now, which is a bit crazy because even if the market drops a little, the domestic market drops a little bit in the UK, it doesn't really matter. If you already own a property, you're buying another one, you're in that market, yours goes down a tiny bit, a little bit maybe, and the one you buy, if it's more expensive, goes down pro rata more. So actually, what's the problem? But for the developers and the investors, that's a different matter because you've got, for instance, at the moment, I'm paying £16,000 a month in empty rates on property that's on the market that's not sold. £16,000 a month I'm paying. So in a normal market, and by the way, the market at the moment is quite good. I think I'm talking about next year, not this year, but if it takes me twice as long to sell the properties, I've got all that rent, I've got all those rates to pay for longer, and so on. So, there's lots of knock-on effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that there's kind of, like you always say, nobody knows the future, nobody knows what's going to happen, but the questions that you're asking there do seem very, very logical. So your advice, I guess, would be that...
I agree with all the points that John made there, and I think that job loss is the biggest risk to the UK property market. However, I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. It will probably have a negative impact overall. However, as I often say, property investment, you can't invest in the UK property market you can only invest in individual properties in individual areas. Yeah. And I think a key point to what John said there was that probably in 12 months, assuming that we do go into a deep recession, finance will likely dry up, which means that at the moment, it's quite a good time to be buying because finance is really strong at the moment. Surprisingly, it's bounced back really strong from lockdown. To be honest, it's probably even stronger than it was pre-lockdown. There's been lenders that have come back to the market with higher loan to values and cheaper interest rates than were available 8 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So in my view, if you're buying a good property in a good area with strong driving factors specific to that area and a broad range of employment in that area, buying now isn't necessarily a bad thing because you can be confident you're going to have a tenant regardless of a recession. And therefore, even if the price does dip slightly, you're in the market, you're receiving a net rental income. And in fact, some areas might even move forward as the overall market moves backwards.
Paul, why do you think that the banks have, or not the clearers, but all the other financial institutions have come back so strongly?
Well, I think it's a surprise to a lot of people because of the negative media that was published at the start of lockdown around the likes of Barclays and Lloyds scaling back their loan to values substantially. And therefore we were getting a lot of questions about, is the mortgage market disappearing? Are they pulling products? And I was constantly saying to people, no, that's not what's happening. It's just on pause. And now that's been proven. Because they've bounced back so quickly. Keep in mind that we're in a historically low interest rate environment. It's never been
incredibly low,
and it can't go any lower unless we go to zero. So lenders have money really cheaply available to them. Their margins have improved, and therefore their appetite for risk can improve a little bit because they've got a bigger margin across their portfolio of loans. So because the market is still strong, in fact, I'd say if anything, over the past 2 weeks, the market has bounced back really strong.
Well, Paul, I have to totally agree with you, which I don't always want to do, but the market, you're absolutely right. I mean, our estate agents we've got and so on, and the developments we've got, I'm pleasantly surprised. How long that will last, we'll have to see. But at the moment, I'm pleasantly surprised. And I understand your point. If you're buying for 20, 25 years, does it matter whether the market goes down 10% next year or not? If you've got rental income, you've got a yield, it's going to go up. Like you said, over 20 years, it goes up on average, it's gone up 5% a year. So I can see your point. If you're not at the sharp end of the job, I can see your point.
I suppose, John, the point I was trying to make there is some people would say, well, if the market might drop by 5 to 10%, should I wait 12 months and buy then? And the answer is no, because you won't be able to get the mortgages that you can get today.
Do you think the mortgages will dry up next year? I can't see that happening personally.
Dry up, but if the market goes backwards and we go into a full-blown recession and you add in, Brexit that might affect finance as well.
Yeah, it's human nature, isn't it? Yeah.
It might tighten up, and therefore, if you can get a 75% or 80% loan to value today, and in 12 months you might only be able to get lower than that, it makes sense to buy today.
What you're saying is take the opportunity while it's there, really.
Yeah, that's good advice there, Paul. Also, this brings us nicely onto your next question, actually, Paul. Talking about the buy-to-let market.
Hello?
Well, I mean, I don't know who's written this, actually. As a matter of interest, does the buy-to-let market exist in Australia? So we'll ask that as the first part of this question, Paul.
Okay, yes, it does. In fact, it's probably a bit more mature in Australia than it is in the UK. It's a bit more ingrained. Buy-to-let mortgages have only been available in the UK since 1998. So it's a relatively new concept. Also, the attitude toward it in Australia is quite different. In that I think Australians are a bit more like Americans in this respect, in that it's viewed as a real positive. They don't call them landlords, they call you a property investor. If you own properties, you're viewed as someone that's, worked hard to become successful. And I think in Australia, we have a bit more of a positive view towards successful people than in general in the UK people do. You see in the media, millionaire kicks cat. Apparently if you've got money in the UK, you're a terrible person. Obviously not to everyone, but in general. And I think
that an underdog in the UK, don't we?
Landlords get a bad rap about being, you know, fat cats that squeeze their tenants to pay maximum rents. And I don't think that's the case at all. You know, certainly not the landlords that I meet with or speak with on a daily basis. So yes, it does exist there. It's also quite attractive in Australia because you have what's called negative gearing, meaning that you can depreciate the value of your asset over a period of 10 years and push your personal taxes into negative territory. So you actually save on tax by owning property.
Oh, okay.
Which, you know, the UK's kind of gone the opposite direction to that.
Yeah. Well, the UK's punishing us, isn't it, really? Government, really.
Yeah. So yeah, it's quite similar. Australia's financial services and, you know, lending and all that sort of thing, and laws as well, is all based on the UK.
Well, that's no surprise there then, Paul.
Yeah, so it's all quite similar, and yeah, so it was an easy transition for me anyway.
So then to come on to the second part of the question here, Paul, it's obviously starts off as a matter of interest. Does the buy-to-let market exist in Australia? Yes, it does. And this person has said, and if so, what are you doing in the UK? Not sure how to take that one.
I get asked that all the time. Look, I think
the weather would be the main question I would have, but yeah.
I think wherever you're from, you kind of take it for granted in some respects, in that, you know, obviously a lot of British people would like to go to Australia, at least for a period of time. And a lot of Australian people like coming over here because, you know, obviously Britain's a good place to live. London's a great place to be for financial services and investment. You've got Europe just around the corner, so you can pop over for a long weekend. You can't do that in Australia. You know, the closest place worth going to is Bali, and that's an 8-hour flight. So yeah, look, I previously ran a financial services company in Australia that was publicly listed in 2014. I left, I came to the UK and started Nova. And I suppose part of the logic to that is, first off, my parents are from here. So, you know, I've got a passport. It was an easy transition. But also, London's the, you know, financial capital of the world. And the level of wealth in London is greater than anything I ever experienced in Australia. So for an advisory business, it makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So what you're really saying, Paul, that Great Britain is better than Australia is what you're really saying, which of course it is. But
well, look, I haven't got that far. But it's a good place.
In John's opinion there, okay, let's move on to Stefano's next question then. This person has written in and said, my wife is Brazilian and she's pushing me to purchase a property in Rio de Janeiro. Is it similar there to the UK property laws, or is it similar to European laws?
It's identical to European laws. So if you buy in Brazil, you're buying under Portuguese law, as it were. So it's very much the same. So the Brazilian codes, whether they're criminal or civil, follow very much European codes, the Napoleonic Code, which is Roman law. And as such, it's totally different from English law, common law. You will have a different procedure. So you'll put some money down as a reservation fee. You'll then pay a 10% deposit, and then you'll pay the balance on completion in front of a notario, the notary public that we've talked about in previous editions, who is the state representative, who is the collector of taxes, and who is the person who will register the property. Interestingly enough, I mean, we've done a lot of investment work for clients, mainly English people, who have bought in Brazil over the last years. And Brazil was a great country to invest in until about 5 or 6 years ago. So they had a lot of something called Minha Casa, Minha Vida, which is my house, my life. And this was a social enterprise by the government because so many people can't afford to buy properties. So you would invest, English people would invest £20,000 and they would get their money back within a year, plus £3,000 worth of interest. And that money would then go to a local builder who would build a property of 54 square meters. And then that property would be mortgageable under Brazilian law to a person who otherwise would not have been able to get onto the property market. So we did a lot of that. It's very, very good. It benefited 3 people: the investor who got his money back plus interest, the local person who otherwise wouldn't have been able to get onto the property ladder, and the banks, of course, who had a mortgageable asset which was worth the value that they were lending, and they're doing this still, and it's very, very good. So it's very good. Yeah, and so it's a very interesting market to be in, Brazil. It's a difficult market in certain parts. It's one that you should enter with care, like you should every other foreign market. But it's certainly a good market to be in. They also have other people who complete transactions for them in offices called cartórios, and cartórios are slightly lesser representatives of the government, but you can do that as well. But yeah, in essence, it's the same as buying in Europe. You have totally different body of law, and the rules are completely different. And just buy with caution, because, for example, buying in Rio de Janeiro is totally different from buying in Salvador, Bahia, in the northeast, sorry, further up the coast that we used to invest in. So investment in Rio de Janeiro brings with it a certain different amount of thinking than anywhere else would. Rio de Janeiro being not the capital, but being the biggest city in Brazil, it brings with it good things and bad things.
Why did you say, Stefano, that up until 5 or 6 years ago it was a good idea?
Well, the government previous to the one which we've got now, which is an ultra right wing government, was the government run by Lula, and he was a communist. So when he and his number two, the woman who then took over from him when Lula went to prison, ran the country down. And they ran the country down, and therefore investment stopped. The majority of investment into Brazil from Europe was from Italians, believe it or not, because many Italians have gone over there first, second generation, and followed. An investment in there has been mainly from Italian families. And then people saw the way that the country was going. It was going into ultra communism, the fraud, the corruption, and they decided to stop investing. So there's many developments that are half built and not completed.
That's amazing.
They're just standing there, basically. And then, of course, we've now got the ultra right wing guy who's in, the military guy, and we've gone from one extreme to the other extreme. Yeah. So Brazil at the moment is
a mess.
Say terra non grata. You wouldn't want to invest in there if you want to keep your money safe. It's not the safest of places to invest.
Yeah, so right now you'd sort of advise this person against it then?
The only reason you would invest in Brazil is if a member of your family is Brazilian, and as such, you know what you're doing and they know what they're doing, because they know the lie of the land literally, and they know what they're investing into. I wouldn't advise investing in Brazil other than that for that reason.
Yeah.
Or unless you're in love.
Well, that's the last reason you would use, John. You should know that as an erstwhile property investor.
Oh, John,
I don't disagree, but it sounds like the guy's under pressure.
He does say his wife is Brazilian. Yeah. She's pushing the purchase.
Yeah, I mean, for that reason, fine. She speaks Portuguese. She knows the lie of the land. They'll be able to talk to other people. And so he's not a first timer, he's not green. No. And many people are doing that. They are buying properties abroad, especially in these times of COVID, and especially because of Brexit. Those of us are over here. I've got a couple of clients who are married to Brazilians, and one of them is buying a property not in Rio, but in Sao Paulo, where she comes from. So, people are doing that. People are thinking about returning back to their roots and buying properties in preparation for them to return at some stage later on in life to their properties.
And in saying all that, just a quick point on kind of the investor's mindset, which is kind of the opposite of what John's just said there. Invest because you're in love. I very much think the opposite. I think investing should be commercially minded and unemotional. And a lot of people, for example, we get asked the question all the time. I want to buy a property that I might retire to at some point in the future, or that maybe I'll go to live in if my situation changes, or that maybe my kids could live in the future. And 9 times out of 10, our guidance would be to completely separate those two things.
Totally.
Money, and then use that money to buy personal assets rather than the other way around.
No, Paul, I totally agree with you. I was just saying that the guy was, I'm just saying the guy's in love, so he's under pressure. That was all I was really getting at.
Oh, no,
and by the way,
being romantic there, John.
It was a flippant remark, John, wasn't it?
And the other thing, can I just say that, Stefano, you astound me with your knowledge, genuinely. You really do. I mean, to know what's happening in Brazil is the same as Europe. I mean, I won't embarrass you, but for someone from Hull, that's quite impressive.
I mean, there was a time, John, when my law firm, in sort of before the first crash, 2008, when we were acting in 15, 16 different countries.
That's amazing.
Ranging from Bulgaria to Argentina. We've done some big developments in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. We've done a lot, as I say, in Brazil. And our strength is that we've covered most of the buying parts of the world, even to the Philippines and to Singapore.
That's quite remarkable, I think. Amazing.
There's nobody else that covers. We are a small firm, but we punch very much above our weight, and there's nobody else that covers the extent of the countries that we do. So, you know, it's experience like you in the development business. We've got the experience in those countries, and we have resources to go back to the law firms that we work with in those countries to actually be able to give the proper advice and the correct advice.
Also, Stefano, it does always seem like you've just got it straight in your head. It's
well,
that's what amazes me.
It's just there.
It's. I suppose it's like John and Paul. It sounds like the two disciples, doesn't it?
Well, it has been said before.
It's a question of you acquire knowledge, and you know, I read a lot, just like they do. I read a lot on. We subscribe to international blogs, international information, and we read it, even if it's snippets of information, and we write on a lot of these things. So I suppose once you've written it, you condense it, it embeds it in your mind, and you're able to draw on it. And I'm happy, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that we've got a team that knows what it does. It's competent, and I'm very proud of myself in the sense that, you know, I've acquired a lot of knowledge, and I can, as you say, draw from it. So it's at my fingertips. So, you know, I'm not an expert like these two guys in development, but I'm an expert in my own area. And I've said before, you know, if you wouldn't come to me for a criminal law matter, because I'd probably have you locked up for the rest of your life as opposed to getting you off. But,
so
you know,
nobody here should get in trouble then?
If you get in trouble, don't come to me, mate. Don't come to me.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good to know. Good to know. Thanks, Stefano. Right. Okay, let's go to John's last question for today. The person says they're looking at doing a commercial deal for their first foray into property investment. Is this a sensible move, or do you think that they're being too ambitious?
Well, the choice between residential and commercial in terms of investment is vast. Residentially, you can easily get funding and mortgages and everything else. With commercial, it's much, much harder. So depending on how much money they've got is the first thing. I always ask the question, people come for help and advice. I say, well, you know, what sort of money you've got to spend? What interests you? What you know, gets you up in the mornings? Because that's also very important. It might be that they really love the buzz of commercial and they find residential a little bit steady. That's fine. But the risk involved in commercial is much, much higher. So for instance, you know, if you're going to buy a vacant commercial property and try to let it, you've got empty rates in the meantime, unless it's grade 2 listed, historically listed, then there's no rates. So that's a big problem to start with. The second problem, obviously, in this market at the moment is whether or not you can let the property. And if you, just because it was let for 20,000 before and now it's empty, and the agent says, oh, it's worth 20,000 a year, is it really worth 20,000 a year rent, or is it worth 10? You know, in this market, how do you tell? So I would be super cautious to jump straight into commercial. I'd cut your teeth. Most people cut their teeth on residential first.
Yep, I agree. We get asked about commercial property all the time.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, it is only really suitable for wealthier people who can afford a bit more risk, because the cost of the debt is more, the loan to values are lower, so you're putting more cash in. Vacancy rates are higher. The yields are usually higher, but the gap between tenants is usually bigger.
The risk, big risks. Yeah.
And also, John, I know you've talked about this before, but you said about, you know, paying for rates while properties are empty and things like that. I guess, you know, people always need a roof over their head and a place to live, but business has so much more risk involved in terms of what's going on in the economy. And
without question, the caveat, of course, to that is that if it's got a residential above it, if you're renting the residential out, it does soften the blow of the vacant commercial underneath.
Sure, yeah.
And if you're buying a property, which is, by the way, if you're buying property that is already let, do some research on the tenants and make sure, you know, if they're a limited company, you go to a company's house, do some research on the tenants and make sure they're substantial and they've got assets and they're making the profit. Because if they're not making a profit, they won't be there long. So do your research. If it's tenanted, got tenants in, do your research on the tenants. Very important.
Right then, guys. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much at home for watching. If you have any questions, please do leave them in the comments or email us a question of property. Sorry, ask. Do apologise. I'll start that again. My mind was totally somewhere else there. Ask ask@aquestionofproperty.co.uk is the email address. We're going to put it underneath anyway, just so that that makes perfect sense. We're going to say thank you very much to Paul, to Stefano, and to John today.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Time. Thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.